Dr. Fauci, thank you so much for being here. We are so excited to talk to you.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much. So I want to start with some questions about vaccines. It's obviously great news that we have them and that they have shown such high levels of effectiveness. But when do you think we'll know definitively whether the vaccines reduce or fully eliminate transmission?
Well, that probably is going to take at least another few months and perhaps longer, because the primary endpoints for both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, and essentially for virtually all the other vaccines, is whether it prevents symptomatic disease. In other words, whether you get symptoms from it. And as you know, that the efficacy of that is really quite striking. It's about 94 to 95%. What you don't know, and you can't tell on first blush, is whether or not a person gets infected, but because they're vaccinated, they get no symptoms, but they still have some level of virus in their nasopharynx. So there are two ways to definitively figure out whether or not that person can transmit. The first one is the easier one, and it isn't as definitive. And that is, you go back and you take a look at people who are infected with no symptoms but have been vaccinated, and you compare them to people who are infected with no symptoms who have not been vaccinated. And you quantitatively determine the amount of virus in the nasopharynx. And if the people who are vaccinated have a remarkably lower level of virus in the nasopharynx, you can extrapolate and make a reasonable assumption that you've diminished the likelihood that they're going to transmit. That's the indirect way. The direct way is to do that same thing, but to do it in cohort studies, such as in college dormitories, where there's a transmission from one to the other, you can sequence the virus and show that the transmissions that occurred came from the people who were not vaccinated versus from the people who were vaccinated. And that's the most definitive way to show that. So in a couple of months, we likely will know indirectly, but probably 6 months or so it'll take to know it definitely.
Right.
Yeah, and that's great that that's at least on the horizon. So then in terms of getting to herd immunity, how is that affected by these new variants, or if, say, the vaccines don't fully prevent transmission?
Well, I mean, obviously it will be affected to some way. One of the things that I think people need to appreciate is that depends on what the variant is. So the variant that's dominant in the UK is referred to as B117. It has the capability of transmitting more efficiently than the standard wild type virus. That's what we refer to the standard virus that's in the community as the wild type virus. One of the encouraging aspects is that the vaccines that we're using now are quite effective against this B117. Not necessarily the case with the South African isolate, which is a 351. The South African isolate, although the vaccine protects against it, it does it at a much less effective level, like multifold diminished, but not diminished to the point of having no effect on the virus, but diminished to the point where it's not as good as what it is against the wild type. So those are going to have some indirect effect on how soon and how quickly we get to herd immunity.
Yeah, for sure. Well, because of variants, there's been a lot of talk about these vaccine booster shots. I'm not complaining. I will take as many shots as I need to take. But do you think vaccines are going to end up being a yearly thing, like the flu shot? Is that the new normal that we're kind of shooting for?
Well, that's conceivable. We don't know that yet. I would not be surprised if for a period of time we would have to give an occasional booster to get a more complete protection in the global community, and number two, to get to the point where the level is so low that you don't really have much transmission. Sort of what we did with smallpox, with polio, and with measles. But one of the things that I think leans towards the need to continue to have to vaccinate people is that if you don't get the global level of infection down, there will always be a threat of variants arising wherever, Africa, Asia, South America. And then even though you think you're protected in this country, by importation of virus, someone comes into the country with a variant that is not protected by the vaccine, then you got a problem. That would lead to what you're alluding to, is the possibility it might sort of like be what we have to do with influenza.
Mhm.
Right.
I hope that's not the case, and I believe that we can avoid it if we do a good job of getting the whole world vaccinated with effective vaccines.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, there is that obvious importance to, making sure it's not just the United States or nations that have access to it. And we hear a lot about the variants that were first discovered in the UK, South Africa, and then to a lesser extent, Brazil. Are there any other variants that you're particularly concerned about? And how much are we in the dark about all of this right now?
Well, I always take seriously any variant that has a functional component to it. Most of the mutations that occur, probably the overwhelming majority of mutations, really don't have any functional relevance. They don't impact whether a virus is more or less contagious, whether it's more or less virulent, whether you escape the protection of antibodies. But every once in a while, you do get a constellation of mutations. And it's usually not just one single mutation. We talk about mutants, but there are probably 5, 6, or 7 or more mutations that lead to that new lineage. The fact is that that particular approach of changes is going to elude protection intermittently. As long as the virus replicates, it's going to mutate.
Mhm.
So, there's an interesting dictum in virology. The best way to prevent mutation is to stop replication.
Mhm.
And when you're dealing with a transmissible virus, the best way to stop replication is to vaccinate as many people as you possibly can so that you don't give the virus the opportunity to mutate.
And on the point of using the vaccines against the variants, should we be surging vaccines to areas of the country with larger outbreaks or areas with more of the newer variants right now?
Well, what's going to happen, I think this was part of your previous question about a booster type. If it looks like it's clear enough that there's enough penetrance of a virus that isn't fully protected by the vaccine, such as the South African isolate. I think that the UK isolate, we're in pretty good shape when it comes to that. But if we get a dominant prevalence of the South African, it is conceivable that we may need, and we're already preparing for that, we want to stay a step ahead of the game, is to make a booster that expresses the spike protein of the new variant as opposed to the standard spike protein. So that maybe 6 months or a year down the line, or the pike, you get people who are vaccinated, but you give them a boost, which is a boost expressing the variant that you're worried about. I think that's conceivable. We haven't done it yet, but we're preparing for the eventuality of having to do that.
Personally, I would like for this to not ever happen again. I don't know about you. So what do we actually need to put in place so it doesn't? Like, is it just an ongoing pandemic task force? Is it just rejoining the World Health Organization? Like, what steps do you actually want to see taken?
Well, all of those things that you mentioned are important. Obviously, we want to be part of the global community. We want to have global surveillance. There were attempts, partially successful some time ago, to get a global network, which is under the category of the Global Health Security Network, where you get communications between countries so that when you see a new emerging pathogen arrive, immediately you identify it, you communicate with the rest of the world, and you begin to develop as quickly as possible vaccines and therapeutics against it.
Right.
You cannot prevent the emergence of a new infection. That usually, almost always, not always, but almost always is part of what we call the animal-human interface, where we encroach upon the environment, as we did with HIV/AIDS in chimpanzees, as we did with wet markets having live animals, and that's how things happened in China. Ebola, when you have people going into bat caves and things like that. So if we can essentially pay more attention to not encroaching inappropriately on that animal-human interface at the same time as we develop universal approaches, like a universal vaccine against a certain prototype or a universal antiviral against a certain prototype, we can respond much better. Like I said, we're not going to prevent the emergence, but we want to prevent the emergence from becoming a pandemic.
Yeah.
And that's where we can do something.
Right.
I promise to leave the bats alone. I won't do it. I'm good.
Same here. You have our pledge. I wanted to ask also one more quickly about the variants of concern here, that are functionally more contagious. Most of them, to our knowledge, sprung up in the last few months or around a year into the pandemic. What does that tell you about the pace of mutations within this virus? And is it good news that it took about a year for these to actually become to a level where they were quite concerning?
I'm not surprised it took that long, because what probably happened, at least in South Africa, is that the standard wild-type virus infected people who were immunosuppressed, because there's a lot of HIV-infected people in South Africa, a substantial double-digit percentage of the population. And what happens is that the virus is not readily cleared from people who are profoundly immunosuppressed. And what happens is that if you don't clear the virus right away, the virus starts to do things to prevent itself from being cleared. And it's a selective pressure on the immune system, to get the virus to mutate. That almost certainly happened to some degree in South Africa. So that's what we suspect went on in South Africa.
Shifting gears quickly to some new guidance from the CDC. Recently, they were talking about the fit of a surgical mask, and they were even suggesting double masking. If it was difficult to get people to put on one mask, how do you suggest here conveying this to the public, getting people to wear two if they need to?
Well, if you look carefully at the CDC's recommendation, they're saying very definitively, everybody should wear a mask. Mm-hmm. One mask is important. However, and there's a however, if you want to get a better fit and dot every I and cross every T and prevent the virus from sneaking in, you might consider, you notice they don't make it an absolute recommendation.
Right.
They urge you to consider double masking. So if this is a regular mask, the standard type, what happens is that under here, it's open, and over here, it might be. So what they say to do is to take a regular cloth mask. Not that the cloth mask is better than this mask, but if you put it on and go like that, you get a much better fit. So there aren't these open spaces here.
Right.
So right now, you have a double mask, but really what it's doing is that it's giving you a better seal. And that really is the essence of their recent recommendations.
Well, we are coming up on Valentine's Day. So do you have any public health or relationship advice that you'd like to give to our listeners? We like to ask you about something that you don't have to talk about all the time. So any advice would be great.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to come home with some candy or flowers and you want to give a big hug and a kiss to somebody, make sure it's somebody that's either part of your household or someone that you know very, very well is being very careful about not getting infected. I mean, I think that even though there are situations where you'd like to gather, we've just been through that with Thanksgiving, with Christmas and the New Year's, but we still are in a danger zone and we still need to maintain distance, wear a mask, avoid congregate settings. Hopefully, as the number of new infections go down. And if you look at the chart, it's really dramatically going down. I mean, just a month or so ago, we were getting 300 to 400,000 new infections a day. Yesterday was, I think, the first day in quite a long time that it was less than 100,000 per day. So we're going in the right direction. Now's not the time to pull back. Now's the time to maintain a real intensity of public health adherence to public health measures.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Dr. Fauci, thank you so much for taking all of our questions. We really appreciate it. We're big fans over here at WAD. Also, if you have 30 seconds, I have someone to introduce you to. So just give me a second. Hey, baby, come here. This is my new puppy, Dr. Fauci.
Oh, isn't that cute?
Yeah, he's a doctor. He doesn't have any actual degrees in medicine, but he's sleepy. He's got huge ears. So
all right. Well, very cute little dog. Thank you. Thank you.
How many pets have you met that have been named after you?
There are several. There are several.
Yeah, it's a good.
They're going to have to live with that name, unfortunately.
Yeah, my neighbors are already like, stop saying it.